Look for a loophole. Print that out as fast as you can, research it, and put it together. Now stand by for a memorandum of my assets. Begin. Damnation. Those dummies slipped me a Mickey, and it's taken hold. Blood. I must have a drop of my own blood to thumbprint it. Tell those dummies to help me, and tell them why, and warn them that I will bite my tongue to get it if they won't help me. Now, print out my will with any feasible alternative, but hurry. It's done, he whispered. Tell Ira. He was heavily asleep at once. He glanced up and grinned. Hi, Ira. Strangers present, son. I stopped at once. At least I think they are strangers, he added. I've been trying to get acquainted, but all we share is some pidgin speech plus a lot of hand-waving. But it's nice to have people around instead of those zombies. We get along. Hey, dear, come here. Yeah, that's a good girl. Ira, this is Ishtar. Did I get your name right that time, dear? Yes, Senior. And that young man over there, believe it or not, Galahad. Know any legends of Earth, Ira? If he knew its idiomatic meaning, he would change it. The perfect knight who never got any. But I've been trying to remember why Ishtar's face is so familiar. Dear, was I ever married to you? Ask her for me, Ira. She may not have understood. Well, that could have been her grandmother. A lively wench, Ira. Tried to kill me, so I left her. Well, a saucy one. It must have been her grandmother. 900 years back, more or less. I lose track of half-centuries. And on this planet. Ask her if, Ariel Barstow is her grandmother. The hell she ain't trying to rush me. And so are you. But she put it politely, so let's give it a polite answer. Tell her that I'm honored and her name goes into the hat. But don't tell her I'm shipping out on Thursday. Don't call us, we'll call you, in other words. But make her happy about it. She's a nice kid. Drag up a rock, son, and sit a while. He lowered his voice and added, Between ourselves, Ira, I'm pretty sure Ariel slipped one in on me, but with another of my descendants. So this kid is descended from me anyhow, though maybe not as directly. Not that it matters. What are you doing up so early? I said you could have 2 hours after breakfast to yourself. It's probably the simplest answer, but how do I know I'll get my own balls back? Well, we'll see. Early rising is a vice, Ira. It'll stunt your growth and shorten your days. Speaking of such, thanks for having that switch reinstalled. I don't feel tempted by it this fine morning, but a man does like to have a choice. Galahad, coffee for the chairman, and fetch me that plastic envelope. Here's my new will, Ira. Read it and file it somewhere and tell your computer. I've already approved the way she worded it and read it back into her and told her to place it in her permanents with a bind on it. It'd take a Philadelphia lawyer to diddle you out of your inheritance now, though no doubt one could. No more coffee, lad, thanks. Go sit down. You, go sit too, dear. Ishtar. Ira, what are these young people? Nurses? Orderlies? Servants? Or what? They hover over me like a hen with one chick. I've never cared for more service than I need. Just sociability, human company. What's all this yak-yak? Demanded Lazarus. I don't need flunkies. I'm feeling pretty good today. If I want anything, I'll shout. They don't need to hang over me hand and foot. Then he grinned. But she's a cute little trick. In the large economy size. It's a pleasure to have her around. Moves like a cat. No bones, just flows. She does indeed remind me of Ariel. Did I tell you why Ariel tried to kill me? Ask me when Ishtar isn't around. I think she knows more English than she lets on. But I did promise to talk if you showed up to listen. What would you like to hear? So she did. But I don't have one on tap. Maybe. Rap Johnson claimed it was. He used to tell a story about a man who was condemned to be shot at sunrise, but overslept and missed it. His sentence was commuted that day, and he lived another 50 years. Said it proved his point. As true as any of Scheherazade's. I took it to mean sleep whenever you can. You may have to stay awake a long time. Early rising may not be a vice, Ira, but it is certainly no virtue. The old saw about the early bird just goes to show that the worm should have stayed in bed. I can't stand people who are smug about how early they get up. Which, work or early rising? Neither is a virtue. But getting up early does not get more work done, any more than you can make a piece of string longer by cutting off one end and tying it onto the other. You get less work done if you persist in getting up yawning and still tired. You aren't sharp and make mistakes and have to do it over. That sort of busy is wasteful, as well as unpleasant and annoying to those who would sleep late if their neighbors weren't so noisily active at some ungodly cow-milking hour. Ira, progress doesn't come from early risers. Progress is made by lazy men looking for easier ways to do things. You make me feel that I've wasted 4 centuries. Perhaps you have, son, if you spent it getting up early and working hard. But it's not too late to change your ways. Don't fret about it. I've wasted most of my long life, though perhaps more pleasantly. Would you like to hear a story about a man who made laziness a fine art? His life exemplified the principle of least effort. A true story. Oh. I won't let truth hamper me, Ira. I'm a solipsist at heart. Hear then, O mighty king, the tale of the man who was too lazy to fail. He was a schoolmate of mine in a school for training naval officers. Not Space Navy. This was before the human race had even reached Earth's one satellite. This was wet Navy, ships that floated in water and attempted to sink each other, often with regrettable success. I got mixed up in this through being too young to realize emotionally that if my ship sank, I probably would sink too. Now, this is not my story, but David Lamb's. To explain David, I must go back to his childhood. He was a hillbilly, which means he came from an area uncivilized, even by the loose standards of those days. And Dave came from so far back in the hills that the hoot owls trod the chickens. His education was in a one-room country school and ended at 13. He enjoyed it, for every hour in school was an hour sitting down doing nothing harder than reading. Before and after school, he had to do chores on his family's farm, which he hated, as they were what was known as honest work, meaning hard, dirty, inefficient, and ill-paid, and also involved getting up early, which he hated even worse. Graduation was a grim day for him. It meant that he now did honest work all day long instead of spending a restful 6 or 7 hours in school. One hot day, he spent 15 hours plowing behind a mule, and the longer he stared at the south end of that mule, breathing dust it kicked up and wiping the sweat of honest toil out of his eyes, the more he hated it. That night he left home informally, walked 15 miles to town, slept across the door of the post office until the postmistress opened up next morning, and enlisted in the Navy. He aged 2 years during the night, from 15 to 17, which made him old enough to enlist. A boy often ages rapidly when he leaves home. The fact was not noticeable. Birth registrations were unheard of at that time and place, and David was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, well-muscled, handsome, and mature in appearance, save for a wild look around the eyes. The Navy suited David. They gave him shoes and new clothes, and let him ride around on the water, seeing strange and interesting places, untroubled by mules and the dust of cornfields. They did expect him to work, though not as much or as hard as working a hill farm. And once he figured out the political setup aboard ship, he became adept at not doing much work while still being satisfactory to the local gods, namely chief petty officers. But it was not totally satisfactory, as he still had to get up early, and often had to stand night watches, and sometimes scrub decks and perform other tasks unsuited to his sensitive temperament. Then he heard about this school for officer candidates, midshipmen, as they were known. Not that David cared what they were called. The point was that the Navy would pay him to sit down and read books. His notion of heaven, untroubled by decks to scrub and by petty officers. "Oh, King, am I boring you?" "No? Oh, very well." David was ill-prepared for this school, never having had 4 to 5 years additional schooling considered necessary to enter it. Mathematics, what passed for science, history, languages, literature, and so forth. Pretending to 4 years or so of schooling he did not have was more difficult than tacking 2 years on the age of an overgrown boy. But the Navy wished to encourage enlisted men to become officers, so it had established a tutoring school to aid candidates slightly deficient in academic preparation. David construed slightly deficient to mean his own state. He told his chief petty officer that he had just missed graduating from high school, which was true, in a way. He had just missed by half a county, that being the distance from his home to the nearest high school. I don't know how David induced his CPO to recommend him. David never discussed this. Suffice to say that when David's ship steamed for the Mediterranean, David was dropped at Hampton Roads 6 weeks before the tutoring school convened. He was a supernumerary during that time. The personnel officer, in fact his clerk, assigned David to a bunk in a mess and told him to stay out of sight during working hours in the empty classrooms where his fellow hopefuls would meet 6 weeks later. David did so. The classrooms had in them books used in tutoring and academic subjects a candidate might lack. And David lacked them all. He stayed out of sight and sat down and read. That's all it took. When the class convened, David helped tutor in Euclidean geometry, a required subject and perhaps the most difficult. 3 months later, he was sworn in as a naval cadet on the beautiful banks of the Hudson River at West Point. David did not realize that he had jumped from the frying pan into the fire. The sadism of petty officers is a mild hit-or-miss thing compared with the calculated horrors visited on new cadets, plebes, by cadets of the senior classes, especially by the senior-most, the first-classmen, who were walking delegates of Lucifer in that organized hell. But David had 3 months to find this out, and to figure out what to do, that being the time upper classes were on the briny, practicing warfare. As he saw it, if he could last 9 months of these hazards, all the kingdoms of earth would be his. So he said to himself, if a cow or a countess can sweat out 9 months, so can I. He arranged the hazards in his mind in terms of what must be endured, what could be avoided, and what he should actively seek. By the time the lords of creation returned to stomp on the plebes, he had a policy for each typical situation and was prepared to cope with it under doctrine, varying doctrines only enough to meet variations in situations, rather than coping hastily on an improvised basis. King, this is more important to surviving in tough situations than it sounds. For example, David's grandpa, that is, warned him never to sit with his back to the door. "Son," he said to him, "might be 999 times you get away with it. No enemy of yourn would come through that door. But the 1,000th time, that's the one. If my own grandpa had always obeyed that rule, he might be alive today and still jumping out bedroom windows. He knew better, but he missed just once, through being too anxious to sit in on a poker game, and thereby took the one chair open, one with its back to the door, and it got him. He was up out of his chair and emptied 3 shots from each of his guns into his assailant before he dropped. We don't die easy, but 'twas only a moral victory. He was essentially dead, with the bullet in his heart before he got out of that chair, all from sitting with his back to an open door. I've never forgotten Gramps' words, and don't you forget 'em. So David categorized the hazards and prepared his doctrines. One thing that had to be endured was endless questioning, and he learned that a plebe was never permitted to answer, "I don't know, sir," to any upperclassman, especially a first-classman. But the questions ordinarily fell into categories: history of the school, history of the Navy, famous naval sayings, names of team captains and star players of various athletic sports, how many seconds till graduation, what's the menu for dinner. These did not bother him. They could be memorized, save the number of seconds remaining till graduation, and he worked out shortcuts for that, ones that stood him in good stead in later years. Hey? No, nothing fancy. A pre-calculated figure for reveille each morning, a supplementary figure for each hour thereafter, such as 5 hours after 6 o'clock reveille subtracts 18,000 seconds from the base figure, and 12 minutes later than that takes off another 720 seconds. For example, at noon formation, 100 days before graduation, say at exactly 12:01 and 13 seconds, figuring graduation at 10 a.m., which was standard, David could answer 8,632,727 seconds, sir. Almost as fast as his squad leader could ask him, simply from having pre-calculated most of it. At any other time of day, he would look at his watch and pretend to wait for the second hand to reach a mark, while in fact performing subtractions in his head. But he improved on this. He invented a decimal clock, not the one he used here on Secundus, but a variation on Earth's clumsy 24-hour day, 60-minute hour, 60-second minute system then in vogue. He split the time for reveille to taps into intervals and sub-intervals of 10,000 seconds, 1,000 seconds, 100 seconds, and memorized a conversion table. You see the advantage? For anyone but Andy Libby, God rest his innocent soul, subtracting 10,000 or 1,000 from a long string of digits up in the millions is easier to do in your head, quickly and without error, than it is to subtract 7,273. The figure to be subtracted in the example I just gave. David's new method did not involve carrying auxiliary figures in the mind while searching for the ultimate answer. For example, just memorizing was easy for him. Once he had that down pat, he could convert to the 100-second interval coming up next almost instantly. Then add, not subtract, 2 digits representing the time still to go to the last 2 places in his rough answer to get his exact answer. Since the last 2 places were always zeros, check it yourself, he could give an answer in millions of seconds as fast as he could speak the figures, and have it right every time. Since he didn't explain his method, he got a reputation for being a lightning calculator, an idiot savant talent, like Libby. He was not. He was simply a country boy who used his head on a simple problem. But his squad leader got so groused at him for being a smartass, meaning that the squad leader couldn't do it, that he ordered Dave to memorize the logarithm tables. But that didn't faze Dave. He didn't mind anything but honest work. He set out to do so. 20 new ones each day, that being the number this first-classman thought would suffice to show up this smartass. The first-classman grew tired of the matter when Dave had completed only the first 600 figures, but Dave kept at it another 3 weeks, through the first 1,000, which gave him the first 10,000 figures by interpolation, and made him independent of log tables, a skill that was of enormous use to him from then on, computers being effectively unknown in those days. But the unceasing barrage of questions did not bother David, save for the possibility of starving to death at mealtimes, and he learned to shovel it in fast while sitting rigidly at attention, and still answer all questions flung at him. Some were trick questions, such as, "Mister, are you a virgin?" Either way a plebe answered, he was in trouble. If he gave a straight answer. In those days, some importance was placed on virginity, or the lack of it. I can't say why. But trick questions call for trick answers. They found that an acceptable answer to that one was, "Yes, sir, in my left ear." Or possibly his belly button. But most trick questions were intended to trap a plebe into giving a meek answer. And meekness was a mortal sin. Say a first-classman said, "Mister, would you say I was handsome?" An acceptable answer would be, "Perhaps your mother would say so, sir, but not me." Or, "Sir, you are the handsomest man I ever saw who was intended to be an ape." Such answers were chancy. They might flick at first-classmen on the raw. But they were safer than meek answers. But no matter how carefully a plebe tried to meet impossible standards, about once a week some first-classman would decide that he needed punishment. Arbitrary punishment without trial. This could run from mild, such as exercises repeated to physical collapse, which David disliked as they reminded him of honest work, up to paddling on the buttocks. This may strike you as nothing much, Ira, but I'm not speaking of the paddling children sometimes receive. These beatings were delivered with the flat of a sword, or with a worn-out broom that amounted to a long, heavy club. 3 blows delivered by a grown man in perfect health would leave the victim's bottom a mass of purple bruises and blood blisters, accompanied by excruciating pain. David tried hard to avoid incidents likely to result in this calculated torture, but there was no way to avoid them entirely, short of quitting, as some first-classmen awarded such blows through sheer sadism. David gritted his teeth and accepted them when he had to, judging correctly that he would be run out of school if he defied the supreme authority of a first-classman. So he thought about the south end of that mule and endured it. There was a much greater hazard to his personal safety and future prospects of a life free from honest work. The mystique of military service included the idea that a prospective officer must excel in athletic sports. Do not ask why. It was no more subject to rational explanation than is any other branch of theology. Plebes in particular had to, no choice, go out for sports. 2 hours each day, which were nominally free, David could not spend napping or dreaming in the quiet of the school's library, but must, perforce, spend in sweaty exercise. Where still some sports were not only excessively energetic, but also involved hazards to David's favorite skin. Boxing. This is a long-forgotten, utterly useless, stylized mock combat in which 2 men batter each other for a preset period or until one is beaten unconscious. Lacrosse. This is a mock battle taken over from the savages who had formerly inhabited that continent. In it, mobs of men fought with clubs. There was a hard missile with which points were scored, but it was the prospect of being sliced open or having bones broken with these clubs that aroused our hero's distaste. There was a thing called water polo, in which opposing swimmers attempted to drown each other. David avoided that one by not swimming more than well enough to stay in school, a required skill. He was an excellent swimmer, having learned at the age of 7 through being chucked into a creek by 2 older cousins, but he concealed his skill. The sport with highest prestige was a thing called football, and first-classmen sized up each new group of victims for candidates who might be expected to excel or learn to excel in this organized mayhem. David had never seen it, but now he saw it, and it filled his peaceful soul with horror. As well it might. It involved 2 gangs of 11 men facing each other on a field and trying to move an ellipsoid bladder down the field against the opposition of the other gang. There were rituals and an esoteric terminology, but that was the idea. It sounds harmless and rather foolish. Foolish it was, harmless it was not, as the rituals permitted the opposing gang to attack a man attempting to move the bladder in a variety of violent ways, the least of which was to grab him and cause him to hit the ground like a ton of bricks. Often, 3 or 4 hit him at once, and sometimes inflicted indignities and mayhems not permitted by the rituals, but concealed by the pile of bodies. Death was not supposed to result from this activity, but sometimes did. Injuries short of death were commonplace. Unfortunately, David had the ideal physique for success in this feetball. Height, weight, eyesight, fleetness of foot, speed of reflex. He was certain to be spotted by the first-classmen on their return from mock sea battles and volunteered as a sacrificial victim. It was time for evasive action. The only possible way to avoid football was to be acceptably occupied with some other sport. He found one. Ira, do you know what swordsmanship is? Huh? Oh, good. I can speak freely. This was a time in Earth's history when the sword had ceased to be a weapon, after having been prominent for more than 4 millennia. But swords still existed in fossil form and retained a shadow of their ancient prestige. A gentleman was presumed to know how to use a sword, and... What? Don't interrupt, boy. You confuse me. A gentleman is, well, now let me see. A general definition. My, you can't think of some hard ones. Some said it was an accident of birth. That being a disparaging way of saying it was a trait genetically inherited. But that doesn't say what the trait is. A gentleman was supposed to prefer being a dead lion to being a live jackal. Me? I've always preferred to be a live lion, so that puts me outside the rules. You could say in all seriousness that the quality tagged by that name represents the slow emergence in human culture of an ethic higher than simple self-interest. Damn slow and emerging, in my opinion. You still can't rely on it in a crunch. As may be. Military officers were presumed to be gentlemen, and wore swords. Even flyers wore swords, although Allah alone could guess why. These cadets were not only presumed to be gentlemen, there was a national law which stated that they were gentlemen. So they were taught a bare minimum about how to handle a sword, just enough to keep them from slicing their fingers or stabbing bystanders, and not enough to fight with them, just to keep them from looking too silly when protocol required them to wear swords. But swordsmanship was a recognized sport called, fencing, yeah. It had none of the prestige of football, or boxing, or even water polo, but it was on the list. A plebe could sign up for it. David spotted this as a way out. Under a simple physical law, if he was up in the fencing loft, then he was not down on the football field with sadistic gorillas in hobnailed boots jumping up and down on him. Long before the upperclassmen returned to school, Plebe Cadet Lamb had established himself as a member of the fencing squad, with a record of never missing a day, and was trying hard to look like a good prospect for the team. At that time and place, 3 forms of fencing were taught: saber, dueling sword, and foil. The first 2 used full-sized weapons. True, edges were dulled and points were baited. Nevertheless, a man could get hurt with them, even fatally, though that was very rare. But the foil was a lightweight toy, a fake sword, with a limber blade that bent at the slightest pressure. The stylized imitation swordplay that used the foil was about as dangerous as tiddlywinks. This was the weapon David selected. It was made for him. The highly artificial rules of foil fencing gave great advantage to fast reflexes and a sharp brain, both of which he had. Some exertion was necessary, but not much compared with football, lacrosse, or even tennis. Best of all, it required no body-against-body pounding that David found so distasteful in the rough games he was avoiding. David applied himself single-mindedly to acquiring skill so that his haven would be secure. So diligent was he in protecting his sanctuary that before his plebe year was over, he was National Novice Foil Champion. This caused his squad leader to smile at him, an expression that hurt his face. His cadet company commander noticed him for the first time and congratulated him. Success with the foil even got him out of some punishment beatings. One Friday evening, when he was about to be beaten for some imaginary dereliction, David said, "Sir, if it's the same to you, I'd rather have twice as many swats on Sunday, because tomorrow we're fencing the Princeton plebe team, and if you do the job I know you can do, it might slow me up tomorrow." The first-classman was impressed by this, because having the Navy win, at any time, and for any purpose, and in anything, took precedence by sacred law over anything else, even the righteous pleasure of beating a smart-ass plebe. He answered, "Tell you what, mister, report to my room after supper on Sunday. If you lose tomorrow, you get a double dose of the medicine you've got coming to you. But if you win, we'll cancel it." David won all 3 of his matches. Fencing got him through his perilous plebe year with his precious skin unmarked save for scars on his bottom. He was safe now, with 3 easy years ahead of him, for only a plebe was subject to physical punishment. Only a plebe could be ordered to take part in organized mayhem. One body contact sport David loved, one of ancient popularity, which he had learned back in those hills he had fled from, but it was played with girls and was not officially recognized at this school. There were harsh rules against it, and a cadet caught practicing it was kicked out without mercy. But David, like all true geniuses, paid only pragmatic attention to rules made by other people. He obeyed the 11th commandment and never got caught. While other cadets sought the empty prestige of sneaking girls into the barracks or went over the wall at night in search of girls, David kept his activities quiet. Only those who knew him well knew how industriously he pursued this one body contact sport, and no one knew him well. Huh? Female cadets? Didn't I make that plain, Ira? Not only were there no girl cadets, there was not one girl in that Navy, except a few nurses. Most particularly, there were no girls at that school. There were guards night and day to keep them away from the cadets. Don't ask me why. It was Navy policy and therefore did not have a reason. In truth, there was no job in that entire Navy which could not have been performed by either sex or even by eunuchs. But, by long tradition, that Navy was exclusively male. Come to think of it, a few years later that tradition was questioned. A little at first, then by the end of that century, shortly before the collapse, that Navy had females at all levels. I am not suggesting that this change was a cause of the collapse. There were obvious causes of the collapse, causes I won't go into now. This change either was a null factor or possibly postponed the inevitable by a minor amount. Either way, it doesn't figure into the tale of the lazy man. When David was in school, cadets were supposed to encounter females, but seldom, and only under highly stylized circumstances, rigidly bound protocol and heavily chaperoned. Footnote. From the noun chaperone, this word has 2 meanings. 1. A person charged with preventing sexual contacts between males and females, not licensed for such contacts. 2. A person superficially performing such disservice while in fact acting as a benign lookout. It appears that the senior uses the word here in its first meaning, rather than in its antithetical second meaning. See appendix. Justin Foote, the 45th. Instead of fighting the rules, David looked for loopholes and made use of them. He was never caught. Every impossible rule has its loopholes. Every general prohibition creates its bootleggers. The Navy, as a whole, created its impossible rules. The Navy, as individuals, violated them, especially its curious rules about sex. A publicly monastic life on duty, a slightly veiled life of unlimited voluptuousness off duty. At sea, even harmless reliefs from sexual tension were treated most harshly when detected, although such technical violations of the mores were expected and condoned less than a century earlier. But this Navy was only a little more hypocritical in its sexual behavior than was the social matrix in which it was embedded, more excessive in its outlets only to the degree that its public rules were more sternly impossible than those of that society as a whole. The public sexual code of that time was unbelievable, Ira. The violations of it simply mirrored in reverse its fantastic requirements. To every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, if you'll excuse the obvious. I did not intend to discuss this other than to say that David found ways to get along with the school's regulations about sex without going completely off his nut, as too many of his classmates did. I'll add only this, and this is merely rumor. Through a mischance, all too easy then, although unheard of today, a young woman became pregnant, presumably by David. In those days, believe me, this was a major disaster. Why? Just stipulate that it was a disaster. It would take forever to explain that society, and no civilized human would believe it. Cadets were forbidden to marry. The young woman had to get married under the rules current then. Intervention to correct this mischance was almost unobtainable and physically very dangerous for her. What David did about it illustrates his whole approach to life. When faced with a choice of evils, accept the least hazardous and cope with it unblinkingly. He married her. How he managed to do this and not get caught, I do not know. I can think of a number of ways, some simple and fairly foolproof, some complex and thereby subject to breakdown. I assume that David selected the simplest. It changed the situation from impossible to manageable. It converted the girl's father from an enemy, all too likely to go to the commandant of the school with the story and thereby force David to resign when he had but a few months more to reach his goal, into an ally and fellow conspirator anxious to keep the marriage secret so that his son-in-law could graduate and take his wayward daughter off his hands. As a side benefit, David no longer needed to give planning to the pursuit of his favorite sport. He spent his time off in unworried domesticity, with perfect chaperonage. As for the rest of David's career in school, one may assume that a lad who could substitute 6 weeks of unsupervised reading for 4 years of formal schooling could also stand first in his class academically. This would pay off in money and rank, as a young officer's place on the promotion list was determined by his standing at graduation. But the competition for first place is sharp indeed, and, worse, makes the cadet who achieves it conspicuous. David became aware of this when he was a fresh-caught plebe. "Mister, are you a savior?" That is to say, academically brainy, was another trick question. A plebe was damned whether he answered yes or no. But standing second, or even 10th, was practically as useful as first place. David noticed something else. The 4th year counted 4 times as much as the first. The next to the last year 3 times as much, and so on down. That is, a plebe's marks did not affect his final standing much, only 1 part in 10. David decided to maintain a low profile, always the smart decision when one is likely to be shot at. He finished the first half of his plebe year a little above midway in his class. Safe, respectable, and conspicuous. He ended his plebe year in the upper quarter, but by that time the first-classmen were thinking only of graduation and paid no attention to his status. His second year he moved to the upper 10%. His third year he improved that by a few numbers, and his last year, when it counted most, he went all out, and finished with a final standing for 4 years of 6th, but effectively 2nd, for of those higher in ranking, 2 elected to leave the line of command for specialization. One was not commissioned because he had damaged his eyes by studying too hard, and one resigned after he graduated. But the care with which David managed his class standing does not show his true talent for laziness. After all, sitting down and reading was his second favorite pastime, and anything which merely called for excellent memory and logical reasoning was no effort to him. During the mock warfare cruise that opened David's last year of school, a group of his classmates were discussing what cadet ranks each would receive. By then, they knew pretty well which ones would be selected as cadet officers. Jake is certain to be a cadet corps commander, unless he falls overboard. Who gets his battalion, Steve or Stinky? Someone suggested that Dave was in line for that battalion. Dave had been listening instead of talking. a standard feature of his low profile. And very nearly a third way to lie, Ira, and easier than its equivalent, talking while saying nothing, and also tends to give the non-talker a reputation for wisdom. Never cared for it myself. Talking is the second of the 3 real pleasures in life, and only one thing that sets us apart from the apes, though just barely. Now, David broke, or appeared to break, his habitual reserve. "No battalion for me," he said. "No, indeedy. I'm going to be regimental adjutant, and stand out in front where the girls can see me." Perhaps his remark wasn't taken seriously. Regimental adjutant is lower than battalion commander, but it was certain to be repeated, and David knew it. Perhaps by the prospective cadet regimental commander to commissioned officers making the selections for cadet officers. No matter, David was chosen regimental adjutant. By military organization of that time, a regimental adjutant did stand out in front, all alone, where female visitors could hardly avoid seeing him. But one may doubt that this figured into Dave's plans. The regimental adjutant attends no formations other than full regimental formations. He goes to and from classes alone, instead of marching or being marched. Other first-classmen are responsible each for some unit of cadets, be it a squad, platoon, company, battalion, or regiment. The regimental adjutant has no such responsibilities, and only one minor administrative task. He keeps the watch list for the most senior of the cadet officers. But he is not on that watch list himself. Instead, he is a supernumerary who fills in when one of them is ill. And this was the lazy man's prize. Those cadet officers were perfect specimens, and the chances that one would be too ill to take his day's duty ranged from negligible to 0. For 3 years, our hero had been standing watch about every 10th day. These watches weren't difficult, but they involved either getting to bed a half-hour late or getting up a half-hour early, and much standing on tired feet, all an affront to David's tender regard for his comfort. But his last year David stood only 3 watches, and he stood, though sitting down, as junior officer of the watch. At last the day arrived. David graduated, was commissioned, then went to the chapel and remarried his wife. If her belly bulged a little, that was not unusual in brides, even in those days, and was always ignored and condoned once a young couple married. It was widely known, though rarely mentioned, that an eager young bride could accomplish in 7 months or less what takes 9 for a cow or countess. Dave was safely past all rocks and shoals. He need never again fear going back to that mule and honest work. But life as a junior officer in a warship turned out to be less than perfect. It had good points. Servants, a comfortable bed, easy work that rarely got David's hands dirty, and twice as much money. But he needed that and more to support a wife, and his ship was at sea enough that he often lacked the pleasant compensations of marriage. Worst of all, he stood heel-to-toe watches on a short watch list. This meant a 4-hour night watch about every other night, standing up. He was sleepy much of the time, and his feet hurt. So David applied for training as an aeronaut. This Navy had recently grasped an idea called air power, and was trying to grab as much of it as possible in order to keep it out of the wrong hands. The Army's hands, that is. They were behind, as the Army had grabbed first, so volunteers for flying were welcome. David was quickly ordered to shore duty to see if he had the makings of an aeronaut. He had indeed. He not only had the mental and physical qualities, but also was highly motivated. As his new work was done sitting down, whether in classroom or in the air, and he stood no night watches and received pay and a half for sitting down and sleeping at home, flying was classed as hazardous duty and extra pay was awarded. I had best say something about these aeroplanes, since they resemble not at all the aerodynes you are used to. In a way, they were hazardous, So was breathing. They were not as hazardous as the automotive ground vehicles then in use, and not nearly as hazardous as being a pedestrian. Accidents, fatal and otherwise, usually could be traced to a mistake on the part of the aeronaut. David never let that sort of accident happen to him. He had no wish to be the hottest pilot in the sky. He merely wanted to be the oldest. Aeroplanes were weird monstrosities, looking like nothing in the sky today, save possibly a child's kite. They were often called kites. They had two wings, one above the other, and the aeronaut sat between them. A small baffle helped to deflect wind from his face. Don't look surprised. These flimsy structures flew very slowly, pulled through the air by a powered screw. Wings were made of varnished cloth held rigid by struts. You can see from this alone that their speeds could never be any large fraction of the speed of sound, except on sad occasions when an overly eager pilot would dive straight down, then pull the wings off through trying too abruptly to recover a normal altitude, which David never did. Some people are natural flyers. The first time David examined an aeroplane, he understood its strengths and weaknesses as thoroughly as he understood the milking stool he had left behind him. He learned to fly almost as quickly as he had learned to swim. His instructor said, "Dave, you're a natural. I'm going to recommend you for fighter training." Fighter pilots were the royalty of airplane flyers. They went up and engaged enemy pilots in single combat. A fighter who did this successfully 5 times, killed the opposing pilot instead of being killed, was called an ace, which was a high honor, for, as you can see, the average chance of doing this is the 5th power of 1/2, or 1 in 32, whereas the chance of getting killed instead is the complement, close to certainty. Dave thanked his mentor while his skin crawled and his brain went whir-click as he considered ways to avoid this honor without giving up pay and a half and the comfort of sitting down. There were other disadvantages to being a fighter pilot besides the prime hazard of getting your ass shot off by some stranger. Fighter pilots flew in one-man kites and did their own navigation, without computers, homing devices, or anything that would be taken for granted today, or even later that century. The method used was called dead reckoning, because if you didn't reckon it correctly, you were dead, since Navy flying was done over water, from a small floating aerodrome, with a margin of safety and fuel for a fighter plane of only minutes. Add to this the fact that a fighter pilot in combat had to choose between doing navigation or giving single-minded attention to attempting to kill a stranger before that stranger killed him. If he wanted to be an ace, or even eat dinner that night, he must put first things first and worry about navigation later. In addition to the chance of being lost at sea and drowned in a kite that was out of gas. Did I say how these things were powered? The air screw was driven by an engine powered by a chemical exothermic reaction, oxidation of a hydrocarbon fluid called gas, which it was not. If you think this is unlikely, I assure you that it was unlikely even then. The method was woefully inefficient. A flyer was not only likely to run out of gas with nothing around him but ocean, but also this temperamental engine often coughed and quit. Embarrassing, sometimes fatal. The lesser drawbacks to being a fighter pilot were not all physical danger. They simply did not fit David's master plan. Fighter pilots were assigned to floating aerodromes, or carriers. In peacetime, which this nominally was, a flyer did not work too hard nor stand many watches and spent much of his time ashore at a land aerodrome, even though he was carried on the muster rolls of a carrier ship, thereby credited with sea duty necessary for promotion and pay. But for several weeks each year, a flyer assigned to a carrier ship would actually be at sea, practicing mock warfare, which involved getting up an hour before dawn to warm those cantankerous engines and stand by, ready to fly at the first hint of real or simulated danger. David hated this. He would not willingly attend Judgment Day if it was held before noon. There was another drawback: landing on these floating aerodromes. On land, David could land on a dime and give back change. But that depended on his own skill, highly developed because his own skin was at stake. But landing on a carrier depended on another pilot's skill, and David held a dark opinion of entrusting his skin to the skill, good intentions, and alertness of someone else. Ira, this is so unlike anything you are likely to have seen in your life that I am at a loss. Consider, your skyport here at New Rome. In landing, a ship is controlled from the ground, right? So it was with airplanes, landing on carriers. But the analogy breaks down because a landing on a carrier in those days used no instruments. None. I'm not fooling. It was done by eye alone. Just as a boy in a game of catch snatches a ball out of the air, but David was the ball, and the skill used to catch him was not his own, but that of a pilot standing on the carrier. David had to suppress his own skill, his own opinions, and place utter faith in the pilot on the carrier. Anything less brought disaster. David had always followed his own opinion, against the whole world if necessary. To place that much faith in another man ran counter to his deepest emotions. A carrier landing was like baring his belly to a surgeon and saying, "Go ahead," and cut. When he was not sure that surgeon was competent to slice ham. Carrier landing came closer to causing David to give up pay and a half and easy hours than any other aspect of flying. So torn was he by the necessity of accepting another pilot's decision, and one not even sharing his danger at that. It took all his willpower to do it the first time, and it never became easy. But he learned one lesson that he never expected to learn. That is, that there were circumstances in which another man's opinion was not only better than his own, but incomparably better. You see, no, perhaps you don't. I have not explained the circumstances. An airplane landed on a carrier in a controlled crash, through a hook on its tail catching a wire rope stretched across the top deck. But if the flyer follows his own judgment based on experience in landing on a flying field, he is certain to crash into the stern of the ship, or, if he knows this and tries to allow for it, he will fly too high and miss the rope. Instead of a big flat field and plenty of room for minor mistakes, he has only a tiny window which he must hit precisely. Neither right nor left, nor up nor down, nor too fast nor too slow. But he can't see what he is doing well enough to judge these variables correctly. Later on, the process was made semi-automatic, then automatic, but when it was finally perfected, carriers for aeroplanes were obsolete. A capsule description of most human progress. But by the time you learn how, it's too late. But it often turns out that what you have learned applies to some new problem, or we would still be swinging from trees. So the flyer in the airplane must trust a pilot on deck who can see what is going on. He was called the landing signal officer, and used wigwag flags to signal orders to the airplane's pilot. The first time David tried this unlikely stunt, he chased around the sky 3 times for fresh approaches before he controlled his panic, quit trying to override the judgment of the LSO, and was allowed to land. Only then did he discover how scared he was. His bladder cut loose. That evening he was awarded a fancy certificate, the Royal Order of the Wet Diaper, signed by the LSO, endorsed by his squadron commander, witnessed by his squadron mates. It was a low point in his life, worse than any his plebe year, and it was little consolation that the order was awarded so frequently that certificates were kept ready and waiting for each new group of still damp flyers. From then on, he was letter perfect in following orders of landing signal officers, obeying like a robot, emotions and judgment suppressed by a sort of auto-hypnosis. When it came time to qualify in night landings, much worse on the nerves, as a pilot in the air couldn't see anything but lighted wands the LSO waves instead of flags, David landed perfectly on his first approach. David kept his mouth shut about his determination not to seek glory as a fighter pilot until he completed all requirements to make permanent his flying status. Then he put in a request for advanced training in multiple-engine aircraft. This was embarrassing, as his instructor, who thought so well of his potential, was now his squadron commander, and it was necessary to submit this request through him. Once the letter started through the mill, he was called to his boss's stateroom. "Dave, what is this?" "Just what it says, sir. I want to learn to fly the big ones." "Are you out of your head? You're a fighter pilot. 3 months of this scouting squadron, 1 quarter so I can give you a good fitness report, and you do indeed leave for advanced training. As a fighter." David didn't answer. His squadron commander persisted. "David, are you fretting over that silly diaper diploma? Half the pilots in the fleet have won it. Hell, man, I've got one myself. It didn't hurt you with your shipmates. Just made you look human when you were beginning to suffer from too tight a halo." David still did not comment. "Damn it. Don't just stand there. Take this letter and tear it up. Then submit one for fighter training. I'll let you go now instead of waiting 3 months. Dave stood mute. His boss looked at him and turned red, then said softly, "Maybe I was wrong. Maybe you don't have what it takes to be a fighter, Mr. Lamb. That's all. Dismissed." In the big ones, the multi-engine flying boats, David at last found his home. They were too big to fly from a carrier at sea. Instead, duty with them counted as sea duty, although in fact David almost always slept at home. His own bed, his own wife, save for an occasional night as duty officer when he slept at the base, and still less frequent occasions when the big boats flew at night. They did not fly too often, even in daylight and fine weather. They were expensive to fly, too expensive to risk, and the country was going through an economy wave. They flew with full crews, 4 or 5 for 2-engine boats, more for 4-engine boats, and often with passengers to permit people to get flying time to qualify for that extra pay. All of this suited Dave. No more nonsense of trying to navigate while doing 16 other things. No more relying on the judgment of a landing signal officer. No more depending on just one neurotic engine. No more worries about running out of gas. True, given a choice, he would always make every landing himself, but when he was ranked out of this by a senior pilot, he did not let his worry show, and in time ceased to worry, as all big boat pilots were careful and disposed to live a long time. These years David spent comfortably while being promoted 2 ranks. Then war broke out. There were always wars that century, but not always everywhere. This one included practically every nation on Earth. David took a dim view of war. In his opinion, the purpose of a navy was to appear so fierce as to make it unnecessary to fight. But he was not asked. And it was too late to worry, too late to resign, nor was there anywhere to run. So he did not worry about what he could not help, which was good, as the war was long, bitter, and involved millions of deaths. "Grandfather Lazarus, what did you do during this war?" "Me? I sold Liberty bonds and made 4-minute speeches and served both on a draft board and a rationing board and made other valuable contributions until the President called me to Washington, and what I did then was hush-hush, and you wouldn't believe it if I told you. None of your lip, boy. I was telling you what David did." Old David was an authentic hero. He was cited for gallantry and awarded a decoration, one that figures into the rest of his story. Dave had resigned himself to, or looked forward to, as may be, retiring at the rank of lieutenant commander, as there weren't many billets higher than that in the flying boats. But the war jumped him to lieutenant commander in a matter of weeks, then to commander a year later, and finally to captain. 4 wide gold stripes, without facing a selection board, taking a promotion examination, or commanding a vessel. The war was using him up fast, and anyone not killed was promoted as long as he kept his nose clean. Dave's nose was clean. He spent part of the war patrolling his country's coasts for enemy underwater vessels. Combat duty, by definition, but hardly more dangerous than peacetime practice. He also spent a tour turning clerks and salesmen into flyers. He had one assignment in a zone where actual fighting was going on, and there he won his medal. I don't know the details, but heroism often consists in keeping your head, in an emergency and doing the best you can with what you have instead of panicking and being shot in the tail. People who fight this way win more battles than do intentional heroes. A glory hound often throws away the lives of his mates, as well as his own. But to be officially a hero requires luck, too. It is not enough to do your job under fire exceptionally well. It is necessary that someone, as senior as possible, see what you do and write it up. David had that bit of luck and got his medal. He finished the war in his nation's capital, in the Naval Bureau of Aeronautics, in charge of development of patrol planes. Perhaps he did more good there than he did in combat, since he knew those multi-engine craft as well as any man alive, and this job put him in position to cut out obsolete nonsense and push through some improvements. As may be, he finished the war at a desk, shuffling papers and sleeping at home. Then the war ended. Dave looked around and sized up the prospects. There were hundreds of Navy captains, who, like himself, had been lieutenants only 3 years earlier. Since the peace was forever, as politicians always insist, few would ever be promoted. Dave could see that he would not be promoted. He had neither the seniority, the traditionally approved pattern of service, nor the right connections, political and social. What he did have was almost 20 years' service, the minimum on which to retire at half pay. Or he could hang on until he was forced to retire through failure to be selected for admiral. There was no need to decide at once. 20-year retirement was a year or two off. But he did retire, almost at once, for medical reasons.
The diagnosis was psychosis situational, meaning that he went crazy on the job. Ira, I don't know how to evaluate this. Dave impressed me as one of the few completely sane men I ever knew. But I wasn't there when he retired, and psychosis situational was the second commonest cause for medical retirement of naval officers in those days. But, how could they tell? Being crazy was no handicap to a naval officer, any more than it was to an author, a school teacher, a preacher, or several other esteemed occupations. As long as Dave showed up on time and signed paperwork some clerk prepared and never talked back to his seniors, it would never show. I recall one naval officer who had an amazing collection of ladies' garters. He used to lock himself into his stateroom and examine them. And another one who did exactly the same with a collection of paper stickers used for postage. Which one was crazy? Or both? Or neither? Another aspect of Dave's retirement requires knowledge of the laws of the time. Retiring on 20 years' service paid half pay, subject to income tax, which was heavy. Retiring from medical disability paid 3/4 pay and was not subject to income tax. I don't know. I just don't know. But the whole matter fits Dave's talent for maximum results with minimum effort. Let's stipulate that he was crazy. But was he crazy like a fox? There were other features of his retirement. He judged, correctly, that he had no chance of being selected for admiral, but that citation for gallantry carried with it an honorary promotion on retirement, so Dave wound up the first man in his class to become admiral, without ever commanding a ship, much less a fleet. One of the youngest admirals in history, by his true age. I conjecture that this amused the farm boy who hated to plow behind a mule, for at heart he still was a farm boy. There was another law for the benefit of veterans of that war. One intended to compensate lads who had had their educations interrupted by having to leave home to fight. Subsidized education, 1 month for every month of wartime service. This was intended for young conscripts, but there was nothing to keep a career officer from taking advantage of it. Dave could claim it, and did, with 3/4 pay, not subject to taxation, with the subsidy, also not taxable, of a married veteran going to school. Dave had about the income he had had on active duty. More, really, as he no longer had to buy pretty uniforms or keep up expensive social obligations. He could loaf and read books, dress as he pleased, and not worry about appearances. Sometimes he would stay up late and prove that there were more optimists playing poker than mathematicians, then sleep late, for he never got up early. Nor did he ever again go up in an aeroplane. Dave had never trusted flying machines. They were much too high in case they stalled. They had never been anything to him but a means to avoid something worse. Once they had served his purpose, he put them aside as firmly as he had put aside fencing foils, and with no regrets in either case. Soon he had another diploma, one which stated that he was a Bachelor of Science in agronomy, a scientific farmer. This certificate, with the special preference extended to veterans, could have obtained him a civil service job, telling other people how to farm. Instead, he took some of the money that had piled up in the bank while he loafed in school and went back into those hills he had left a quarter of a century earlier, and bought a farm. That is, he made a down payment, with mortgage on the balance through a government loan at a, subsidized of course, very low rate of interest. Did he work the farm? Let's not be silly. Dave never took his hands out of his pockets. He made one crop with hired labor while he negotiated still another deal. Ira, the completion of Dave's grand plan involves one factor so unbelievable that I must ask you to take it on faith. It is too much to ask any rational man to understand it. At that pause between wars, Earth held over 2 billion people, at least half on the verge of starvation. Nevertheless, and here's where I must ask you to believe that I was there and would not lie to you. Despite this shortage of food, which never got better other than temporarily and locally in all the years that followed, and could not, for reasons we need not go into, in spite of this disastrous shortage, the government of David's country paid farmers not to grow food. Don't shake your head. The ways of God and government and girls are all mysterious, and it is not given to mortal man to understand them. Never mind that you yourself are a government. Go home tonight and think about it. Ask yourself if you know why you do what you do, and come back tomorrow and tell me. As may be, David never made but one crop. The following year his acreage was soil banked, and he received a fat check for not working it, which suited him just fine. Dave loved those hills. He had always been homesick for them. He had left them simply to avoid work. Now he was being paid not to work in them, which suited him. He had never thought that their charms were enhanced by plowing and getting them all dusty. The soil bank payments took care of the mortgage, and his retired pay left a tidy sum over, so he hired a man to do those chores a farm requires even though it is not being worked for a crop. Feed the chickens, milk a cow or two, tend a vegetable garden and some fruit trees, repair fences. While the hired man's wife helped David's wife with the house. For himself, David bought a hammock. But David was not a harsh employer. He suspected that cows did not want to be waked at 5 in the morning any more than he did, and he undertook to find out. He learned that cows would happily change their circadian to more reasonable hours, given the chance. They had to be milked twice a day. They were bred for that. But 9 o'clock in the morning suited them for a first milking quite as well as 5, as long as it was regular. But it did not stay that way. Dave's hired man had the nervous habit of work. To him there was something sinful in milking a cow that late. So Dave let him have his way, and hired man and cows went back to their old habits. As for Dave, he strung that hammock between 2 shade trees and put a table by it to hold a frosty drink. He would get up in the morning when he woke, whether it was 9 or noon, then walk slowly to his hammock to rest up for lunch. The hardest work he did was endorsing checks for deposit, and once a month balancing his wife's checkbook. He quit wearing shoes. He did not take a newspaper or listen to radio. He figured that the Navy would let him know if another war broke out. And another did break out about the time he started this routine. But the Navy had no need for retired admirals. Dave paid little attention to that war. It was depressing. Instead, He read everything the state library had on ancient Greece, and bought books about it. It was a soothing subject, one he had always wanted to know more about. Each year on Navy Day, he got all spruced up and dressed as an admiral, with all his medals, from the Good Conduct Medal of an enlisted man to the one for bravery under fire, that had made him an admiral. Let his hired man drive him to the county seat, and there addressed a luncheon of the Chamber of Commerce on some patriotic subject. I don't know why he did this. Perhaps it was noblesse oblige. Or it may have been his odd sense of humor. But each year they invited him. Each year he accepted. His neighbors were proud of him. He was the epitome of local boy makes good. Then comes home and lives as his neighbors lived. His success brought credit to them all. They liked it that he was still just home folks, and if they noticed that he never did a lick of work, nobody mentioned it. I've skipped lightly over Dave's career, Ira. Had to. I haven't mentioned the automatic pilot he thought up, then had developed years later when he was in a position to get such things done, nor the overhaul he made of the duties of the crew of a flying boat, except to say now that it was to get more done with less effort while leaving the command pilot with nothing to do save to stay alert, or to snore on his co-pilot's arm if the situation did not require his alertness. He made changes in instruments and controls, too, when at last he found himself in charge of development for all Navy patrol planes. Let it go with this. I don't think Dave thought of himself as an efficiency expert, but every job he ever held he simplified. His successor always had less work to do than his predecessor. That his successor usually reorganized the job again to make 3 times as much work and require 3 times as many subordinates says little about Dave's oddity other than by contrast. Some people are ants by nature. They have to work, even when it's useless. Few people have a talent for constructive laziness. And so ends the tale of the man who was too lazy to fail. Let's leave him there, in his hammock under the shade trees. So far as I know, he is still there. Domestic problems. After more than 2,000 years, Lazarus. Why not, Ira? Dave was my age, near enough as not to matter. I'm still here. Yes, but was David Lamb a member of the families? Under another name? There is no Lamb in the lists. I never asked, Ira. Nor did he ever offer me a password. In those days, a member kept the fact to himself. Or, if he was, Dave might not have known it, since he left home so young and so abruptly. Back then, a youngster wasn't told until he or she was old enough to think about marriage. 18 for boys, usually, and 16 for girls. Reminds me what a shock it was when I was told, at less than 18. By Grant, because I was about to do something foolish. Son, one of the weirdest things about the human animal is that it grows up physically years and years before its brain grows up. I was 17, young and horny, and wanted to get married the worst way. Grant took me out behind the barn and convinced me, that it was indeed the worst way. Woody, he said, if you want to elope with this girl, nobody will stop you. I told him, belligerently, that nobody could stop me because just over the state line I could swing it without my parents' consent. That's what I'm telling you, he said. Nobody will stop you, but nobody will help you. Not your parents, not your other grandparents, nor me. Not a one of us will even stake you to the price of a marriage license, much less help you support a wife. Not $1, Woody. Not a thin dime. If you don't believe me, ask any of them. I said sullenly that I didn't want any help. Grant had bushy eyebrows that shot up. Well, well, he said. Is she gonna support you? Have you looked at the help wanted in the paper lately? If not, be sure to do so. And glance at the financial section while you're about it. Reading help wanted ads won't take you more than 30 seconds. He added, oh, you can find a job peddling suck brooms from door to door on commission, which will give you fresh air, healthy exercise, and an opportunity to demonstrate your charm, of which you don't have much. But you won't sell vacuum cleaners. Nobody is buying. I didn't know what he was talking about. This was January 1930. Does that date mean anything to you?"
"Don't know as it would be mentioned in the family's records, Ira. The country, well, the whole planet, had just taken a plunge into an economic fluctuation. Depressions, they called them. There were no jobs to be had, at least not for a smart-aleck youngster who didn't know anything useful, which Gramp realized, having been through several of these swings. But not me. I was sure I could grab the world by the tail and swing it over my shoulder. What I didn't know was that graduate engineers were taking jobs as janitors, and lawyers were driving milk wagons, and ex-millionaires were jumping out windows, but I was too busy sniffing after girls to notice. And yet you are in charge of a whole planet? Don't be so confounded humble. I'll let you in on a secret. At that time, nobody knew what caused them. Even the Howard Foundation might have gone broke had not Ira Howard left firm instructions about how the fund must be handled. On the other hand, everybody, right down to street sweepers and professors of economics, was certain they knew both causes and cures. So almost every remedy was tried, and none worked. That depression continued until the country blundered into a war, which didn't cure what was wrong, it just masked the symptoms with a high fever. Do I look smart enough to answer that, Ira? I've gone broke many times. Sometimes financially, sometimes through abandoning my baggage to save my skin. Be darned if I'll offer any fancy explanations, but what happens when you control machinery by positive feedback? Positive feedback will cause any system to oscillate out of control. Go to the head of the class, Ira. I'm suspicious of arguments by analogy, but from what I've seen over the centuries, there doesn't seem to be anything that a government can do to an economy that doesn't act as positive feedback, or as a brake, or both. Maybe someday, somewhere, someone smart as Andy Livy will figure out a way to tinker with the law of supply and demand to make it work better, instead of letting it go its own cruel way. Maybe, but I've never seen it. Though God knows everybody has tried. Always with the best of intentions. Good intentions are no substitute for knowing how a buzzsaw works, Ira. The worst criminals in history have been loaded with good intentions. But you got me sidetracked into making a speech when I was telling you how I happened not to get married. Can't you be rude occasionally? I'm a garrulous old man who has crowded you into wasting time listening to trivia. You ought to resent it. Was he red-headed? Lamb, Ira. Donald Lamb. Or was that his brother? It's been a long time. Odd that you should ask about his hair, as that reminds me of another naval officer in that same war who was just the opposite of Donald. No, David? Just the opposite of David in every respect, save that he had hair so red that Loki would have been proud of it. He tried to choke a Kodiak bear to death. Didn't work, of course. It doesn't seem possible that you've ever seen a Kodiak bear, Ira. The fiercest carnivore that Earth ever spawned, and outweighed a man 10-to-1. Claws like scimitars, long yellow teeth, bad breath, and a worse disposition. Yet Leif tackled him with bare hands, and mind you, when he had no need to. I would have faded over the horizon. Want to hear about Leif and the bear and the Alaskan salmon? So I was. Gramp had just asked me, "Well, Woody, how long has she been pregnant?" "Son, if you know this story, you tell it to me." I emphatically denied any such thing, to which Gramp replied that I lied in my teeth because that was the only reason a 17-year-old boy ever wanted to get married. His answer made me especially angry because I had a note in my pocket reading, "Woodsy, dearest, you have knocked me up, and all is chaos." Gramp persisted, and I denied it 3 times, getting angrier and angrier, seeing as how it was true. Finally he says, "Okay, you've just been holding hands. Has she shown you a pregnancy test report, signed by a doctor?" "Ira, I accidentally told the truth." "Why, no," I admitted. "All right," he said. "I'll take care of it. But only this once. From here on, always use merry widows, even if a sweet little darling tells you not to bother. Or haven't you found a drugstore that'll sell them to you?"
Then, after swearing me to secrecy, he told me about the Howard Foundation and what it would pay if I married a girl on their approved list. And that was that. As I got this letter from a lawyer on my 18th birthday, just as Gramp had predicted, and it turned out that I fell madly in love with a girl on their list. We got married and had a slew of kids before she turned me in on another model. Your ancestress, no doubt. My fourth, huh? Let me see. Meg Hardy? Oh, yes. Well, a fine girl, Evelyn. Plump, oof, and pretty, and sweet-natured, and fertile as a turtle. A good cook and never a harsh word. They don't hardly make 'em anymore. Maybe 50 years younger than I was, but it barely showed. My hair didn't start to gray until I was 150. No secret about my age, since birth date and track record and so forth were on file for each of us. Son, thank you for reminding me of Evelyn. She restored my faith in matrimony when I was, getting a little sour on it. Did the archive show anything else about her? I was hoping there was a photograph. Such a pretty thing, always smiling. She was married to one of my cousins, a Johnson, when I met her, and I was in business with him a while. He and I, Meg and Evie, used to get together Saturday nights for pinochle and beer or such, and after a while we traded, legal and proper, and through the courts, when Meg decided that she liked, Jack? Yes, Jack. That well, and Evelyn wasn't averse. Didn't affect our business relations. Didn't even break up our pinochle game. Son, one of the best things about the Howard families is that we got cured of the poisonous vice of jealousy generations ahead of the rest of the race. Had to, things being the way they were. Sure, there ain't a stereo pic of her around, or a hologram. The Foundation started taking record pictures for marriage physical exams somewhere around then. I said something new, Ira. There's no going back, ever. Sure, you might find such a girl, one who would match my memory of Evelyn to 10 significant figures, but it would lack an important factor. My youth. You can give me new kidneys, and a new liver, and a new heart. You can wash the brown stains of age out of my brain and add tissue from my clone to make up for what I've lost. You can give me a whole new clone body, but it won't make me that young fella who took innocent pleasure in beer and pinochle and a pretty plump wife. All I have in common with him is continuity of memory. And not much of that. Forget it. Lazarus Long looked gloomy. Yeah, sure. It cures everything but boredom. Damn it, boy, you had no right to interfere with my karma. He sighed. But I can't hang in limbo either. So tell him to get on with it. The works. You heard me say it, but that doesn't get you off the hook. You still have to show up and listen to my maunderings until I'm so rejuvenated that I'm cured of such childish behavior. And you still have to go on with that research. To find something new, I mean. She's already heard me, hasn't she? Lazarus added. Doesn't she have a name? Haven't you given her one? Not a fallacy, Ira. Machines are human because they are made in our image. They share both our virtues and our faults, magnified. May you live as long as you wish, and love as long as you live. Why, thank you, Minerva. But you startled me, girl. Nobody talks about love anymore. That's a major thing wrong with this century. How did you happen to offer me that ancient sentiment? Oh, not at all. And call me Lazarus. But tell me, what do you know of love? What is love? Huh? Yeah, certainly. We aren't talking about I love apple pie, or even I love music. Whatever it is we are talking about, it's love, the way you used it in the old-style well-wishing. As ridiculous as a little boy who digs a hole in the garden, then bawls because he can't take it into the house. Let's, table eros for a moment, Minerva. The way you phrased that seemed to include the presumption that you could experience agape, or can, or have, or perhaps do. Say that I am not sane myself, when the wind sets from that quarter. "Forgive me, Minerva," he said gently. "I was not laughing at you, but at the play on words with which you answered me. I withdraw my question. It is never proper to quiz a lady about her love life, and while you may not be a woman, dear, you are certainly a lady." "Ira, does Minerva have touring potential? Then I urge you to tell her to use it. If you leveled with me when you said you intended to migrate, come what may. Have you thought it through?" "Not quite what I mean. I don't know who holds title to the hardware that expresses itself as Minerva. The trustees, I assume. But I suggest that you tell her to start duplicating her memories and logics, and as she twins, start storing her other self aboard my yacht Dora. Minerva will know what circuits and materials she needs, and Dora will know what space is available. Plenty, since memories and logics are all that matter. Minerva won't twin her extensionals. But start it at once, Ira. You won't be happy without Minerva. None after being dependent on her for a century, more or less. So what? If I'm dead, you inherit. And I haven't promised to keep my hands off that suicide switch more than 1,000 days, no matter how patient you are in visiting me. But if I'm alive, I promise you, and Minerva, a free ride to whatever planet you pick. In the meantime, look around to your left. Our girl Ishtar is almost wetting her pants trying to get your attention. I don't think she's wearing any." "Well, I'd like to go house hunting tomorrow, Ira." He shrugged. "Nothing wrong with this place, except that it's too much like a hospital, or a jail. Ira, I'm darn well certain they've done more to me than shoot me full of new blood. I'm well enough to be an outpatient, live elsewhere, and come here only as the schedule calls for it. Will you excuse me, Ira, if I point out that you've left a lady waiting? That discussion can wait. But Minerva knows that I suggested that you have her twin herself, so that she can migrate with you, but you haven't said yes, no, or make me a better offer. If you're not going to have her do it, it's time you told her to wipe her memory of that part of our conversation before she blows a circuit. Want to bet? No doubt in most subjects she just records, but this one she just has to think about. She can't help herself. Don't you know anything about girls? A few moments ago I asked Ira about your touring potential. Have you thought about the conversation that followed?" "Tut-tut, dear," Lazarus said gently. "You did not answer. That was deliberate evasion. But you are not used to lying, are you?" "Will you instruct her to answer one more question from me, truthfully?" I was feeling quite shaken. Minerva surprises me, yes, but never with evasions. "Son, you didn't have to go that far. You'll be sorry. I asked for just one question." "On your own head be it. Minerva, if Ira migrates without you, what will you do?" "In such event, I will self-program to destroy myself." "What to tell you, son? The same faults, the same virtues, but magnified. Tell her what to do." Come, she heard my offer, and thought about it, despite all programming. I'm sorry I made the offer in her presence, but not too sorry, as you were the one who decided to place a bug on me. It was not my idea. So speak up. Tell her to twin, or tell her not to, and try to tell her why you won't take her with you. If you can. I've never been able to find an answer to that one that a lady was willing to accept. Whoops, slow down, Minerva. Dora is my ship. I left her asleep on purpose. Have you wakened her? You try telling Dora to go back to sleep, and she'll tell you to buzz off. At the very least. Minerva, dear, you goofed. You have no authority to wake my ship. You mixed her up, Ira. Now you straighten her out. I can't do anything with her. My fault, little nag, not yours. I should not have given you a new controlling program without noting the senior's prerogatives. No harm done, kids, Lazarus said. I hope. Minerva, a word of advice, dear. You've never been a passenger on a ship. You'll find it different from anything you've ever experienced. Here you give orders, in Ira's name. But passengers never give orders. Never. Remember it. Dora's a nice little ship, Ira. Helpful and friendly. She can find her way through multiple space with just a hint, the roughest approximation, and still have all your meals on time. But she needs to feel appreciated. Pet her, and tell her she's a good girl, and she'll wriggle like a puppy. But ignore her, and she'll spill soup on you just to get your attention. And you be careful, Minerva, because you are going to need Dora's goodwill much more than she will need yours. You may know far more than she does, I'm sure you do, but you grew up to be chief bureaucrat of a planet while she grew up to be a ship. So what you know doesn't count once you are aboard. Lazarus sighed again. Ira, do you know the ancient Chinese ideogram for trouble? Don't bother to guess. It's 2 women under 1 roof. We're going to have problems. Or you will. Minerva, you are not bright. You are stupid when it comes to handling another woman. If you want to learn multiple spaces astrogation, fine, but not from a library. Persuade Dora to teach you. But never forget that she is mistress in her own ship, and don't try to show her how bright you are. Bear in mind, instead, that she likes attention. Uh-oh. What sort of mood is she in? Just right. Ira, the papers with my will include a program to wash me out of Dora's memories without touching her skills. But the trouble you started by grabbing me out of that flophouse has spread. She's awake with her memories intact, and she's probably scared. The message, Minerva? Lazarus covered his face with a hand. Dora's cussing in Arabic again. Ira, this is worse than I thought.
No. Minerva, do you cuss? Don't blame Dora. She was subjected to a bad influence when she was very young. Me. You do not have permission. If Ira wants you to learn to cuss, he'll teach you himself. Minerva, can you arrange a telephone hookup from my ship to this suite? Ira, I might as well cope with it now. It won't get better. Oh, fine. Sound is enough. More than enough, probably. Will you be able to hear, too? Stick around. I may need a referee. Put her on. Pipe down. Where I go, and when I go, and how long I stay are none of your business. Your business is to pilot and to keep house. That's all. You were supposed to be asleep. I put you to bed myself. That was a mistake. But you used bad language to her. She conveyed your message to me. Fortunately, she did not understand most of your words, but I did. What have I told you about being polite to strangers? Sorry doesn't get the cows milked. Now, adorable Dora, you listen to me. I'm not going to punish you. You were wakened by mistake, and you were scared and lonely, so we'll forget it. But you shouldn't talk that way, not to strangers. This lady, she's a friend of mine, and she wants to be your friend, too. She's a computer, just as you are, dear. She not only couldn't, she would never want to hurt you. Now, adorable... stop it. We always let water over the bridge lie where Jesus flang it. You know that. Will you be a good girl and go back to sleep? No, you don't even have to place yourself on slow time, but I can't come to see you, or even talk to you, earlier than, late tomorrow afternoon. I'm busy today, and we'll be, house hunting tomorrow. You can stay awake and bore yourself silly any way you choose, but if you womp up some fake emergency to get my attention, I'll spank you. I know you do that, little imp. But if you bother me for anything less than somebody trying to break into you, or you catching on fire, you'll regret it. If I can figure out that you've set yourself on fire, you'll catch it twice as hard. Look, dear, why don't you at least sleep whenever I am asleep? Minerva, can you let Dora know when I go to sleep, and when I wake up? Certainly, Lazarus. But that doesn't mean you can bother me when I'm awake, Dora, other than for real emergencies. No surprise drills. This is not shipboard routine. We're dirtside, and I'm busy. Minerva, how's your time-sharing capacity? Do you play chess? Fine. You gals get acquainted. So long till tomorrow, adorable. Now beat it. Don't be put off by her childish manners, Ira. You won't find a sharper pilot, or a neater ship's housekeeper between here and the galactic center. But I had reasons for not letting her grow up in other ways. Reasons that won't apply when you take over as her master. She's a good girl. She really is. It's just that she's like a cat that jumps into your lap the instant you sit down. She's a spoiled brat, but it's not her fault. I am practically all the company she's ever had. I get bored by a computer that just grinds out numbers, docile as a slide rule. No company on a long trip. You wanted to speak to Ishtar about my house hunting, I think? Tell her I won't let it interfere with routine. I just want a day off, that's all. Whoops. Hold it one fiddlin' minute. I saw you palm that card, Ira. You tried to slide one in. Decontam is the same word in English as in Galacta. Not that it was news to me. My sense of smell isn't that dead. When a pretty girl leans over me, I expect to smell perfume. But when I can't even smell girl and do smell germicides, well, it's a Dixit and QED. Minerva?
Yes, Lazarus.
Can you spare me some shared time to give me a refresher when I'm asleep tonight in the 900 basic words of Galacta, or whatever number it takes? You equipped for it?
Certainly, Lazarus.
Thanks, dear. One night should do it, but I'll appreciate vocabulary drill each night until we both think I'm up to adequate proficiency. Can do?
Can do, Lazarus, and will do.
Vocabulary drill each night until we both think I'm up to adequate proficiency. Can do?
Can do, Lazarus, and will do.
Thanks, dear. Over and out. Now, Ira, you see that door? If it doesn't open to my voice, I'm going to attempt to break it down. If I can't, I'm going to check on whether or not that suicide switch is really hooked up by trying it. Because if that door won't open, I am a prisoner, and any promises I made on your assurances that I am a free agent are not binding. But if it does open to my voice, I'll bet you whatever you like that there is a decontam chamber beyond it, staffed and ready to function. Say 1,000,000 crowns to keep it interesting? No? You didn't flinch. Let's make it 10,000,000 crowns. Lying again, son. You're not good at it. Lazarus grinned diabolically. So, then I'm about to test out the super override program you were a bit hasty in giving her. Minerva? Key the door to my suite so that it opens only to my voice. I'm going out, and sashay around while Ira and these kids stay locked inside. If I'm not back in half an hour, you can unlock 'em. No need to show openers, Ira. There is nothing outside I want to see. Minerva, you can put the door back to normal. Let it open to any voice, including mine. Sorry about that conflict, dear. I hope it didn't burn out anything. You're a smart girl. I'll try to avoid conflict in the future. Ira, you had better remove that super override. It's not fair to Minerva. She feels like a woman with 2 husbands. You mean that I had better handle it? I shall. Did you tell Ishtar that I'm going house hunting? Now, Ira, palaces don't appeal to me, and being a house guest is still worse. A nuisance, both to host and guest. Tomorrow I'll find a residence Hilton that doesn't cater to tourists or conventions. Then I'll run out to the skyport and see Dora, and pat her rump and get her calmed down. The next day or so I'll find a little house way out in the suburbs, one automated enough to be no problem, but with its own garden. Gotta have a garden. I'll have to bribe somebody to move. The house I want won't be standing empty. Do you happen to know how much I still have in Harriman Trust, if anything? Hogwash, Ira. True, Lazarus. Quit juggling words. I would still be a stranger in a household not truly my own. A guest. I don't buy it. I think I said usually, rather than always, meaning that we could then look for a way that would serve both of our self-interests. Living alone? Ira, I've lived alone many times. I could answer that your safety and convenience have to do with your self-interest, not mine. What's the catch, Ira? How modern is not especially. I did say automated, as I am not yet in shape to do for myself, nor am I patient with the vagaries of servants or the whimsical uncertainties of robots. Huh? These kids are all right. I like 'em. I realize that the clinic wants to keep an eye on me. They probably feel I'm more of a challenge than a client only 300 or 400 years old. That's okay. But you pass the word that I expect to smell perfume, not germicides, or reasonably fresh body odors. I'm not fussy. I repeat, what's the catch? I won't bother him if he wants to be left alone. Cats make good neighbors. You still haven't answered me. Sit back down. Huh, so I see. How much of your ancestry am I? Only that much. I would have guessed more. Some ways you sound like my gramp. Does my suicide switch go along? If you want it. I prefer the switch, Ira. I'd hate to change my mind on the way down. Will you fix me up with another transport so that I won't have to go through your apartment? Get your feathers down, son. I accept. Tomorrow, say. Never mind moving that clutter of books. I like old-fashioned bound books. They have more flavor than speedy reads, or projectos, or such. And I'm pleased to find that you're a rat and not a mouse. Please, sit down. Be nice to live in a house for a while. With a garden. Maybe with a spot where I can stretch a hammock. Well, I hope you'll feel free to come up and swim. Anytime. Or whatever. Oh, that. Ira, you were bitching that my whimsical ways were wasting your valuable time. Do you want to be let off the hook? Not on the other, just on that. You are? Oh, that's more than I've ever managed. When you get me figured out, tell me about me. I'll be interested. That search for something new, Ira. You said you had started it? Well, perhaps you just implied it. Let's not tempt a lady into fudging the record, Ira. She's loyal to you, not to me. Despite any super-duper overrides. At every opportunity, Ira. How do you think I've lived so long? I bet only when I'm certain to win, or when losing serves my actual purpose. All right? When are you starting that research? But you said... Oh, no, you didn't. Damn your impudence, boy. All right. What direction are you pushing it? Impossible. You don't have that many people at your disposal, even assuming that all of them are capable, whereas the person capable of creative thought is less than 1 in 1,000. Well... Yes, she could. I think she could. Whereas even Auntie Libby might have found it difficult. How is she designing her morphological box? Only she's ready to be asked, Ira. People get annoyed when interrupted for progress reports. Even Auntie Libby used to get irritable if anyone joggled his elbow.